All living things exhibit patterns, patterns of growth and patterns of decline. When I was a student in college, I had a professor who taught history according to Arnold Toynbee, and Arnold Toynbee plotted the rise and fall of 21 civilizations. As I began working in corporations, I began to see similar patterns. Companies that are young and growing, emerging. The Apple computer during its early days. I worked with a company in Atlanta that was doubling in size every year. And it exhibited certain patterns that were very, very different from large, mature corporations. And it struck me that there was an inevitable difference, and perhaps a necessary difference, in the pattern of behavior, the culture of an emerging company and a company that's mature and perhaps even declining. There's also clearly a difference in leadership style, the way leaders behave and influence the culture and influence people when a company or when a culture is emerging and when a culture is declining. In Barbarians to Bureaucrats, I've attempted to categorize those stages of development and the leadership styles. And I'll run through them very quickly for you. This cycle here describes the black line, describes not the size of the company or necessarily the age of the company, but the culture of the company. This is the curve of the culture. And it's not to be confused with the curve of the assets. The culture is, as it goes up, describes creativity, describes the creation of social unity, strong purpose, bonding of people together, the energizing of people, common direction, etc. As cultures begin to decline, things begin to disintegrate. You know, it is not a new phenomenon that there are disintegrating families, that there are alcohol problems or drug problems. During the declining days of Rome, it wasn't uncommon for people to go through 15 marriages. And people had lost faith in the institutions. They'd lost faith in the government. They lost faith in their religion. And alcohol and drugs were a big problem. That's a common pattern of decline versus emergence. This is the culture curve. Now, the problem is that there seems to be in human history, both in the history of corporations and civilizations, a distinct difference in the pattern of the culture and the size of the mass, the material size. Rome conquered the British Isles and built Hadrian's Wall, the furthest extension of the Roman Empire. 250, 300 years after the culture was clearly in disintegration, clearly declining. Simply the weight of the mass had momentum. It had power on its own. It kept going. Even though it was uncreative, it continued its conquering ways. But once the culture has begun to decline, the decline in the mass is inevitable. The wall gets built, and energetic people are outside the wall and will be coming over. It's only a matter of time. Now, the problem is, in the corporation, what do we manage to? What are we sensitive to? What do we have our eyes on? What are we responding to? Are we responding to this curve or to this curve? Managers tend to look at what?
The bottom line.
The numbers, right? We're looking at this curve. And the problem is, here, right, we're going that way. Things are great. We make more cars than anybody in the world. What do they know, right? We make more of this than anybody in the world. What do they know? We're going that way. But the culture, and if one examines the large U.S. steel companies, auto companies, and some other cultures that have suffered decline, one can clearly see that they lost their social unity, loyalty to the institution, creativity. 20, 30 years, not 200, but maybe 20 years, prior to the loss of market share or the loss of assets. But once that begins, this is written. It is inevitable that that will decline unless it can be pulled back up. Now, there's some common characteristics during the early stage of a life cycle and during the later stages of a life cycle. One characteristic during the early stage of life cycle is dynamic motion. People are in motion. People are changing. People are not static. Primitive societies, before they begin the civilizing process, are static. Aborigines, Western Australia, remain static for tens of thousands of years, clash with other culture, get in motion, change, and the process of change is the process of growth and development. Once they become dominant again, here, they tend to worship dead ancestors here because the heroes are way in the past, you see. During the period of emergence of a culture, there are heroes of the present, and people worship or look up to heroic characters that exist within the culture today. During periods of decline, they again worship dead ancestors. All the heroes are in the past. About 10 or 12 years ago, I was consulting with Ford Motor Company, and I was interviewing managers, and one of the questions I like to ask is, who are your models? Who are your heroes? And we all have models and heroes, people we'd like to be like. And when I asked this question, the answer was all people who were dead. They didn't exist within the culture. They were people of the past. Today, again, at Ford Motor Company, because it's coming back up the curve, it's regenerating, right? There are, again, heroes of the present. And who are those heroes? Those heroes are people who've issued forth creative responses. Arnold Toynbee described the process of the development of a culture as the process of challenge and response. And it's the job of the leader to creatively respond to challenge, to recognize challenge, and to creatively respond to challenge. And he said that when the leader responds creatively to challenge, that successful response does not lead to a condition of ease, where everything is comfortable, but rather leads to a higher level challenge, requiring a new and creative response. And that creative response does not lead to a condition of ease, but rather to a higher level challenge, requiring a new and creative response, until the leader begins to rely on yesterday's successful response, but in the presence of today's challenge, and decline has begun, when they've lost their creativity. He said that the creative leaders like the Pied Piper marching down the street, playing the beautiful melody, and the dancers fall merrily behind, dancing to the tune. But a point comes where he loses his tune, his creativity, and he turns to see the dancers falling out of line, and seizes the lash to whip them back into line, assuring their rebellion. And there is the whole cycle, from creativity to dominance and to rebellion. And it's rebellion that one always sees during the declining stages of the life cycle curve. Those are some common characteristics of periods of emergence and decline. And this can be broken down into some fairly predictable stages, and I'll just describe these very briefly. But stage one is very different than previous stages. You know, during stage one, there are no tall buildings, there are no great cities, and there aren't a lot of stock analysts involved in what we're doing. We're not too worried about how pretty the annual report is. Stage one is the stage of what I will call the prophet. It is true that in the beginning was the Word. Not a phrase I made up. And it's true. In the beginning is the Word, the idea, the value, the belief, the vision, right? It's in here. It's not in the bank account. And it's not in the material structure. Low in material forces here, strong in spiritual forces. It's the idea. Thomas Edison, founding prophet of the General Electric Corporation and the Edison Company, said, "My business is thinking." He lived in the world of ideas. Was he a good businessman? He was bankrupt 11 times. He was a slob. He was an administrative nightmare. He lost things constantly. In his laboratory, he would chew tobacco and he'd spit on the floor. His wife bought him a spittoon, which he didn't use. She said, "Thomas, why don't you spit in the spittoon?" He said, "Well, the spittoon, it's hard to hit, but the floor, you never miss," right? And I wonder, would General Electric hire this guy today? You know, could he survive? He had 1,000 patents. The light bulb, the locomotive, the mimeograph machine, all kinds of things. A creative genius, right? But not what we think of as a business person. But was he a business person? You see? He gave the creative spark that really propels. It's the rocket blast that propels things up the life cycle curve. It gives people the cause, the purpose, the reason to sacrifice. That's what the prophet always does. Now, you can't stay in that stage of development. You don't have a great society, and you don't have a great company just in the day of the prophet. You've got to go into the next stage of development. I'll call it stage two. And it's the stage of the barbarian. Now, this is not the person you'd most like to work for. This is not the greatest consensus manager. In fact, on this side of the life cycle, things tend to be very command, decision-making oriented. As they move towards the center, things tend to be more consensus or collaborative. And as things again move back towards disintegration and crisis emerges again, managers tend to revert back to command. The prophet was certainly not the manager of consensus decision-making. Who's going to argue with the prophet, right? I mean, he has the word. The barbarian is the commanding, decisive, action-oriented Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun. You know, when we think of the barbarian, probably the barbarian we most likely think of is Attila. And we sort of think he must have been cruel, right? We think he was cruel because he was coming this way. He was attacking us, right? When our guys went out that way, we called him Alexander the Great, see? Because he was going that way, he wasn't coming this way. But the personality was exactly the same. And it's the personality of decisive, action-oriented, kind of a youthful. You know, why do we want young people in the military, not old people? Old people can pull triggers too, but young people tend to be barbarians. Barbarians tend to be young, right? Tend to be very action-oriented, dynamic. They don't get too confused thinking about things and want to plan everything out. Less security conscious, right? Well, that's sort of the barbarian. If you want to understand leadership in the context of Western civilization, this is the most autocratic thing I'll say, you have to know Alexander. And you have to know Alexander because he made the mold, he made the pattern that leaders have been imitating ever since. Alexander created the model of the leader who created loyalty as a response to that leadership. And since Alexander, Caesar was copying, imitating Alexander. Napoleon was imitating Alexander. Leaders have imitated Alexander ever since. What was the pattern? When Alexander was 20 years old, he took over his father's army. He was leading an army when he was 16. By the time he was 30, he conquered essentially what was all the known world at the time. Alexander had a love affair with his army. There was an intimate connection, an affection, an affiliation that he created with his soldiers. And he created it by always being with them, always suffering what they suffered, always leading the charge into battle. He was never found on the 40th floor of the office tower sending memos down from on high. He was with them in battle. He rode on the plains of Isis, one of the major battles against King Darius and the Persians. He rode at the front. He charged from the right, and he rode at the front of his companions. Who were his companions? His cavalry, which he called his companions, okay? He had a great sense of theater. You know, people have accused Ronald Reagan, the reason we think he was a good president, because he was an actor. He knew theater. Well, you know what? Great leaders from the beginning of time have known theater. They've understood theatrics. On the plains of Isis before the battle, it's estimated that Alexander gave 50 speeches. He'd ride up and down in front of his army, and he'd do this where he would yell some things at them, and they'd yell back. He'd do this, I don't know what it's called, but this back and forth response thing to all of his army. And of course, they didn't have electronics, and they figured to have done it to his whole army, he must have done it 50 times. Well, this was theatrics, you see. He understood those things very well. He understood the psychological connection between leader and follower. Alexander rode into the center of King Darius's line. Hand-to-hand combat caused King Darius's guards to retreat. After the battle, Alexander went to the tent of the wounded men, knelt down, prayed with the wounded men, asked them to tell their story of battle. He would then go out and tell their story, making a hero of the common soldier. When their conquering was done and they were marching back across the Indian desert, Alexander, the soldiers were dying of thirst and starvation coming across the desert. The officers were mounted. Alexander was the first officer to dismount, to go back and walk with his soldiers. Why? If you love someone and they're suffering, where do you want to be? With them, right? And what's the response from them that is virtually guaranteed? It's like the laws of physics. You can call it love in return. You can call it loyalty, right? Total loyalty, that's right. And it's guaranteed. You know, it's a law of physics, right? Alexander's soldiers never rebelled against him, except one time when they'd come back to what's the Holy Land now, and he wanted his core Macedonian soldiers to go home and raise a new generation, frankly. And they rebelled. And the leader of the rebellion came to him with tears in his eyes, saying, "How could you? Don't you know we want to be with you?" And since that day, leaders have sought that relationship. But some of them now send memos down from the 40th floor tell the dummies to be loyal, you know. Can't quite understand why the connection isn't being made. That's the barbarian. Cortez was a barbarian. Conquered Mexico, landed on the shores of Mexico. What was the first decision he made? Burn the ships. Was not the controller of the expedition, right? He burnt his ships down to the sea. A simple idea put in the men's mind, only one way we're going. We're going to conquer 600 against 60,000 marching into the jungle, right? The Aztecs had tall buildings, differentiated structure, specialized rooms. Barbarians don't have a den, a living room, a dining room, and a rec room, okay? They have a room. It's a tent, a hut. Things are simple. The structures, physical structures, have a lot to do with the structures in our mind, how we think about things. And in advanced civilization, we think about specialization and a lot of separate structures and so forth. In the simple age of the barbarian, none of that exists. And the 600 conquered the 60,000. The 60,000 who believed that they had lost their god, Quetzalcoatl, had disappeared, left them, gone into the ocean. In the front of Cortez's column, they carried what? The cross, right? The conquering is the conquering of the human spirit. Cortez and Alexander understood what General Patton understood, who said that every war is the same. The tools change, but the war is the same. You defeat the soul of man. And I think that's exactly right, and I think it's right in business just as it is in the conquering of a civilization. It's the human spirit that conquers. It's not the the technology or the capital or the buildings, all of which can be acquired and ways can be found to achieve if the human spirit is there. And that's what's being created during this stage of development. But you can't stay in the age of the barbarian either. You've got to soon go into the next stage of development. On Alexander's death, what happened to his empire? Disintegrated. Why? Because he was the empire. His personality, centralized decision-making. There was no structure. There were no institutions. It is why George Washington would not be king, because he believed in a government of laws, not of men or personalities, right? Alexander believed in a government of personalities. He was the personality. And like many entrepreneurial companies, where the leader, central decision maker, strong personality may have created the product, created the company, everything revolves around him or her, but on their death or retirement, things fall apart because they have not created the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the separation of powers, the systems and structure. And that's what stage 3 is all about. It's what I call the age of the builder and explorer. There's differentiation now. We have secured territory. So some people stay home and start building up cities. See, and I'm Genghis Khan marching across the plains. We haven't been specialized. We've all done our own thing. We've made our own swords, our own chariots, our own wheels, tended our own goats. But now there are a lot of us. There are 10,000 of us marching across the plain. And I look out across the plain. I don't like what I see, because some of your wheels are more square than they are round, and your chariot's going boom, 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 and you're all beat up before we ever get into battle. And I say, look, Susie here makes the nicest, roundest wheels. You know, she's not so great with the sword anyway. So I say, look, stay back and just make wheels, okay? And take these 50 folks and teach them how to make wheels like you. And she does, and you know what's going to happen? Just be in a blink of an eye. She's going to have a hub department, a rim department, and a spoke department, right? And that's the development of horizontal structure. And paralleling that, vertical structure, just almost mathematically, you know, corresponding to that. She'll have a junior hub maker, a master hub maker, a hub maker supervisor, and a hub maker plant manager before you know what happens, right? And that's the development of both vertical and horizontal structure, and it's good because she's sending out now more and more perfectly round, consistent, great wheels, and our army is just, you know, it's humming across the plain, right? And we're doing more conquering. We're better off for it. Everything's working great. But now something begins to change. You know, we were all out there together dying for the cause. There was this thing between us. We were a band of brothers, you know. I mean, we were tied together. But now I want to be a master hub maker. You know, I don't know what those guys are doing out in the field, but I'm trying to be a master hub maker. And motivation changes, and the style of management, the task of management changes as structure gets differentiated. And because now we are motivated by moving up and developing increasingly specialized competence, that tends to take on a life of its own, if not intelligently held in check. And it tends not to be held in check because the value system now begins to value up. We want to move up. When we were, you know, Attila didn't move up. He went that way, right? But now we want to move up. We want to move up in the structure, up in the building, et cetera, et cetera. The whole motivational process has now begun to change. And now with that change, we begin to have increasing levels of administration. Because we have junior hub makers, master, we've got to know who shows up for work. We've got to do performance appraisal. We suddenly have a human resources department. We have accountants and finance now to keep track of money. Money starts to happen. You know, money starts to become more and more dominant in our thinking, right? And also we are increasingly thinking about what's in it for us, you see. And it's not just that we become, you know, something wrong with us now, but the whole system is teaching us to look at it in terms of what's in it for us. That's the way the system is designed now, rather than us all doing something together. Increasingly, we're doing things alone. Increasingly, we're separated in terms of our specialized functions and so forth, right? And now we have more and more administration, that's stage 4, to keep track of things. And the building of administrative structure takes on a life of its own. And a day comes in the life of the culture where systems and structure become more dominant in the life of people in the culture than the substance and the spirit that propelled things up the life cycle curve. The managers now being promoted up the ladder are increasingly financial managers, staff managers, administrative managers, not the people who make the car, who make the product. In Marysville, Ohio, at Honda, Iriura Majiri, who's the president of Honda Worldwide Manufacturing now, designed the engine that is currently being produced in the motorcycle plant. Those are designed racing engines. He knows the technology, is in touch with the technology. On top of many of our corporations, what we have is financial managers, administrative managers who don't know the technology, don't know the product, you see? And they therefore become increasingly out of touch with the real work that people are doing in the organization. That happened in civilization too. One of the clear signs of the decline, the loss of Roman might, was when Crassus, a moneylender, became general of one of the legions and led the legions into the sand where the Scythians rode around shooting arrows. They didn't, the Romans had developed the one best way. You know, they knew how to, the world's greatest military might, and they knew how to lead an army. They knew what and they had the policy manuals written, all the procedures were written, Roman law was written, and it was all being administered very well, and we all knew the right ways to do things, and the more that is true, the less creative we are. And we are less able to respond to new and different challenges. And Crassus was unable to respond to some dummies. These Scythians were dummies. They weren't civilized people. They weren't educated people. They didn't know how to fight right. And they just rode like the Indians, you know, around the wagon trains, shooting arrows, and took 20,000 prisoners and 10,000 into slavery, you see. And that defeat was the defeat of the human spirit, unable to respond creatively to challenges anymore. It was a sign of the loss of vitality. But it's the dominance now of administrative structure. The same thing happened at Ford Motor Company. Robert McNamara and the Whiz Kids came in right after World War II, created a renaissance at Ford Motor Company during the 50s by creating order. It was an administrative nightmare before they came in. But they learned that that's what they were reinforced. They thought that's what good management is: counting, recording, budgeting, planning. And anybody can run a factory. Selling, please, you know, budgeting, counting. The value system now has changed, right? And we got the Fairmont. That was the car that you kind of turned the wheel and you pray. It went over there somewhere, you'd be never sure. But Robert McNamara was sitting in the back seat of the Lincoln reading numbers. He never had his hands on the wheel, never drove the car. You see? Robert McNamara left Ford Motor Company. He went where?
Went to the government.
Went to the government, DOD. As we were about to do what? Became our head military guy as we were about to go into Vietnam. And I was in Vietnam. And we did a great job of counting and recording. We knew where everything was. We had computers. We had filing. We could have killed those dummies with filing cabinets. We would have won that war, right? The only problem is, see, we've now entered the stage of the bureaucrat, and where control has become the dominant force. The tight grip of control gets tighter and tighter, driving out creativity, driving out the energy, the purpose that propelled things up here. And the only problem in Vietnam was the guy that we were fighting said, "You will kill 10 of my men for every one of yours I kill." That's what Ho Chi Minh said. He said, "Go ahead, count." And he understood what General Patton understood. And he understood what Alexander Cortez understood, that it is the defeat of the human spirit. It's not the defeat of the material, you see. And it's not the counting, recording, and administrating that wins the battle. Anytime a bureaucrat meets a barbarian on the battlefield, the battle's over before it's begun, because one's counting, the other's killing. I know it's a simple concept, but it really is what makes a difference, okay? By the time we were in Vietnam, we didn't have any barbarians. You know, General Patton may have been our last barbarian. Remember the scene in General Patton? After, if you remember seeing the movie, where after the battle, he goes to the tent of the wounded men, he kneels down and prays with the wounded men. Who does he think he is? Thought he was Alexander. It's kind of, he was a little crazy, wasn't he? Believed in reincarnation. Thought he was Alexander, and a lot of other, if you look at all the people he thought he was, you know who they all were? They were all barbarians, right? Maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe he was right. In spirit, that's exactly who he was. He was the barbarian personality, right? By the time, and he was always saying dumb things. You know, he'd say something like, "You'll kill 10 of my men for every one yours I kill, and you'll tire." That's the kind of thing General Patton would say, which is why he wasn't a general by the time we got to be in Vietnam, right? That administrative mentality had taken over, and we lost. Finally, you have, in stage 6, the last stage in the life of the corporation, what I call the inheritor of wealth. Great power now, great wealth. A few years ago, I did a talk at the Marquis de Lafayette Hotel in Boston. Fantastic hotel. One of these hotels you walk in, just kind of bounce across the floor. The carpet's 6 inches thick. Chandelier just, you know, fills this immense room. Must have 10 tiers of gold or brass, you know, just incredible. Guy in a little red monkey suit comes out, he takes your bags whether you like it or not. I went up to the counter. I had a guaranteed late arrival. It was 9:30 at night. He handed him my American Express card, and he said, "Yes, we have your reservation, but it'll be an hour. They're cleaning the rooms." And really, I mean, we all mess up, right? I can live with that. I find a lot of that trailing around. But what really bothered me was that the way he told me, it was like, "So, you have another question?" I said, "Oh, no, you have a chandelier. Excuse me." You know, I mean, And what had happened was, you see where we are now? The material trappings, the gold and the glitter, but the substance and the spirit that creates wealth are now gone. The next day after I did my talk, I was out in the hall, on the foyer, there were all these fox hunt pictures. You know those fox hunt pictures? I always wondered, what's the deal with these fox hunt pictures, right? Well, on that day, I figured out what the deal was on these fox hunt pictures. Who goes on fox hunts?
The rich.
Yeah, I mean, does a barbarian go on a fox hunt? I mean, come on, if a barbarian wants a fox, man, he'll get himself a fox, you know, and he won't have to go tally-ho either, you know. What we have now is the 10th generation dukes and earls. You know how the original duke became a duke? He rode on the left flank for the prince into battle. He was a big, tough guy. He won, and the prince looked at him after battle and said, "You look like a duke to me," and gave him a parcel of land to keep him on his side, right? There was a functional relationship between being a duke and something you could do. Now we have the 10th generation wimps going on fox hunts. If they actually had to ride those horses into battle, you know, they look great. I mean, the picture is beautiful. They have a great chandelier, right? The carpet's thick, the red jackets are there, there's a guy blowing a bugle, it's all a charade. They're playing the game of battle, you see? And if they actually rode those horses into battle, they'd be the first ones knocked off their horses. And unfortunately, at the top of a lot of our aristocratic corporations, we have fox hunters who look great, but they're the inheritors of wealth. If they had to make the product, look the customer in the eye, sell the product, they would starve, you see? And they become increasingly out of touch, alienated from those doing the real work. And now we have rebellion, and every rebellion in all of human history, and I challenge you to think of one where this is not true, was produced not by revolutionaries, but rather by aristocrats. They are the stimulus. The response to the aristocrats are the revolutionaries, you see. And King George didn't speak English. He was out of touch with the Renaissance popes who were wrapped up in a world of materialism, appointing a 14-year-old son of Lorenzo de' Medici, the merchant of Florence, to the College of Cardinals. With concubines and bullfights in the Piazza of St. Peter and betting on horse races, they had lost touch with the reality of their own faith, the spirit, but the structure was there, you see? And that's what produces the revolution. Now, if you look at this curve, it's kind of depressing. You know, 21 civilizations have gone through this whole pattern. And if we look at some of our companies, we might say, you know, what the heck, let's go to the orgy. It looks kind of inevitable, you know? Well, I don't think so. I have another idea. And, you know, we're told that there may be a day not to be followed by night. How can that be? How can we escape this pattern? Maybe there's a time that will come when we will escape this process of emergence and decline, night and, you know, day and night, right? And here's how I think that will happen. Here's how I think we can make that happen in the corporation. I think we can see it in the corporation. I know companies 140 years old who are still going that way. And I know companies 10 years old that have gone through the whole cycle. And here's what the difference is. Those companies that maintain their competence and maintain their vitality have what I call a synergist. And that's my real hero of the story, is what I call the synergist, and that I'll call stage 7. And synergy means combining qualities, bringing different things together. We've got to have the quality of the prophet, vision and values, energy, sacrifice. We've got to have the quality of the barbarian, action-oriented, decisive, get it done now. We've got to have the quality of the builders and explorers in stage 3, specialized competence, production technology, engineering, marketing competence, right? And we've got to have the qualities of the administrator. We don't need the qualities of the bureaucrat and aristocrat. They can off with their heads. But we've got to have those qualities, and those qualities have got to learn to work together synergistically. And here is the lesson of a management team. On a management team, would you really want 9 barbarians sitting around on a management team? You know, here is the lesson and the appreciation of differences and diversity and the unification of diversity. You see, if you had 9 barbarians, it'd be exciting, all right. You know, 9 H. Ross Perot's, all, you know, dominating. It would be very exciting, but it'd be chaos, right? You also wouldn't want 9 prophets sitting around dreaming, you know, coming up with great ideas. You'd never get anything done, right? Nor would you want 9 administrators. Everything would be neat and orderly, but you never go anywhere, right? So what you want is a blending of those things. And what you want is a management team that appreciates the unique qualities and the differences among people, right? And draws out those differences among people and is able to create synergy among them. And that, I think, is the key to continued upward vitality, health, and process, and breaking out of this process of emergence and decline, really breaking through to that day not to be followed by night. And I think that we are on the verge of creating that in the corporation. We're on the verge of, and as we do that in the corporation, I think we will also do it for society as a whole. I think that's the lesson of Barbarians to Bureaucrats.